Sahara, the largest desert on Earth. A place that seems eternal, vast, empty, and unforgiving. But not long ago, this same land was alive. Imagine a world of rivers and grasslands where today you'd only find sand and stone. A Sahara filled with life, teeming with crocodiles, elephants, hippos, and human settlements. 10,000 years ago, the desert bloomed. Monsoon rains swept across North Africa, transforming the dunes into green valleys. Archaeologists call it the African humid period, an age when the Sahara looked more like the African savannas of today. People thrived here. They hunted. They herded cattle. They painted their lives onto the rock walls of caves. Beautiful images of giraffes, fish, and humans dancing under the rain. When you look at the Sahara today, it's hard to believe it was ever alive. But under the sand, there are still bones of fish and fossils of trees that grew beside ancient rivers. The desert wasn't always here. It became this way. Slowly, century by century, the rains disappeared. The people didn't vanish all at once. They adapted. Some moved south, chasing the fading grasslands. Others stayed behind, building their homes near shrinking oases, clinging to the last traces of water. These survivors would become the architects of forgotten kingdoms, civilizations hidden under the very sands that buried their past. In the center of what is now southern Libya lies a region called Fezzan, a basin surrounded by mountains and dunes. To an outsider, it looks like nothing could survive there. But beneath the sand, something remarkable once existed. Around 2,000 years ago, a people known as the Garamantes made Fezzan their home. They were not nomads or wanderers. They built cities, real cities, in the middle of the desert. Their secret: water. Deep underground lay ancient aquifers, fossil water trapped from the time when the Sahara was green. The Garamantes discovered how to reach it. They dug vast tunnel networks called fogaras, sloping gently down to channel water across miles of desert. Some stretched for over 30 miles, dug by hand, without machines. With this underground lifeline, they turned dust into farmland, fields of wheat, orchards of dates, and gardens fed by invisible rivers. Their capital, Garama, stood as a desert metropolis. Clay walls, workshops, streets, and even burial chambers carved into stone. From this hidden kingdom, they traded gold, salt, and slaves with Rome, Egypt, and sub-Saharan Africa. They were, in every sense, a forgotten superpower, one that thrived in a place no empire dared to conquer. For centuries, the Garamantes ruled the center of the Sahara. They were the bridge between North Africa and the Sahel, the pulse of trade routes that crossed the dunes long before camel caravans were common. But while they were builders and traders, they were also warriors. The Romans described them as fierce raiders, swift chariots gliding over the sand, striking from nowhere, then vanishing into the desert heat. Yet beyond these stories of war and mystery, the Garamantes represented something profound: the triumph of knowledge over nature. They turned an impossible land into a living system, one maintained by ingenuity, cooperation, and discipline. Their underground canals were masterpieces of engineering. Their society, though isolated, showed clear evidence of hierarchy, writing, and art, and they thrived for nearly 1,000 years. But nothing lasts forever. The desert, patient as time itself, began to reclaim its power. The water table dropped. The fogaras ran dry. The empire that had conquered thirst began to thirst itself. When the fogaras failed, the Garamantes' cities began to die. Their fields withered. Their trade collapsed. Some tried to dig deeper, desperate for one last well of water. Others left, walking north toward the Mediterranean or south toward the Sahel, leaving behind a kingdom that the desert would consume. By the time Rome fell, Garama had already become a ghost city. For more than 1,000 years, it lay buried, forgotten beneath dunes and silence. When explorers rediscovered its ruins in the 20th century, they found skeletons lying beside broken tools, tunnels caved in, pottery still sealed with desert dust. The Sahara had erased their memory, but not entirely. In the shifting sands of Fezzan, archaeologists continue to unearth fragments of the past, walls that still stand, scripts no one can read, and tunnels that still echo with the sound of ancient water. The Garamantes are gone, but their defiance remains. Proof that even in the harshest place on earth, human determination once made the desert bloom. When the Garamantes vanished into the dunes, they left behind more than ruins. They left paths, faint traces of the first trans-Saharan roads, worn into the sand by the feet of traders and the hooves of their beasts. Those paths still lie hidden beneath the dust, invisible from the ground, but sometimes, from the air, you can see the shadows of their geometry. Long, straight scars that lead from one forgotten oasis to another. For centuries, those trails lay quiet. The wind buried their stones. The sand filled the wells. The last fires of the Garamantes faded, and silence reclaimed their valleys. But the desert remembers, and eventually it would awaken again. This time not to the sound of war chariots or plows, but to the slow, rhythmic groan of caravans. The secret was the camel. Introduced to North Africa around the 3rd century, it was unlike anything the desert had ever known. Horses could run fast, but they needed water. Oxen were strong, but they sank into the dunes. The camel, with its long lashes, padded feet, and strange patience, could walk for days without drinking, cross scorching plains, and carry loads that would have broken any other beast. It was not just an animal, it was a key. And with it, the Sahara was unlocked. What had once been an impassable sea of sand became a highway. Tribes that had once feared the desert began to navigate it. Small family caravans grew into organized expeditions, stretching from the edge of the Mediterranean down to the forests of the Niger River. The desert, which had divided the continent for millennia, began to connect it instead. The trade routes took shape slowly, following old Garamantian wells, ancient dry rivers, and the stars themselves. The most precious cargo was not gold, but salt. Great slabs of it, hacked from the mines of Tagaza and Bilma, stacked high on camelbacks and bound for the humid south where people needed it to live. In return came ivory, hides, slaves, cola nuts, and the fine gold dust of Bambouk and Wangara, traded grain by grain, as though the earth itself were paying tribute. A single caravan could stretch for miles, hundreds, even thousands of camels, their hooves sinking silently into the sand. The air shimmered with heat. The only sounds were bells, footsteps, and the whisper of men speaking softly to one another, timing their pace to the stars. At night, fires glowed across the dunes like a scattered constellation. Each light marked a family, a tribe, a life moving between worlds. Along these routes rose the oasis cities, improbable places like Gadams, Tadmakat, and Walata. At first, they were nothing but clusters of tents beside a well, outposts of survival in a landscape designed to kill. But over time, they grew into fortified towns, their walls painted white to reflect the sun, their markets rich with goods from every corner of Africa and beyond. Here, Berber guides met black African traders. Arab scribes copied texts beneath the shade of palm trees. Salt met gold, north met south, and the desert, once a barrier, became the bridge. By the 10th century, the Sahara was no longer a void. It was a living network. It had its own cities, its own rhythms, and its own kind of civilization. And at the heart of it all was the camel, that patient, silent ship of the desert, carrying the pulse of trade through a sea of shifting sand. Out of the desert's silence came wealth, and from that wealth, kingdoms. At the edge of the Sahara, where the dunes give way to grasslands, villages began to grow rich from the passing caravans. They traded grain and cattle for salt, cloth, and metal. Soon these villages became towns, and the towns became kingdoms. The first to rise was Ghana, not the modern nation we know today, but an ancient empire, older than almost any other in West Africa. By the 8th century, its capital, Kumbi Saleh, was a crossroads of the world. There were two cities side by side, one for the king and his court, and another for Muslim traders who had come from the north. Between them, gold flowed like water. Ghana controlled the gold fields of Bambouk and Wangara, and more importantly, it controlled the trade. No caravan could pass without paying tribute. Salt came south, gold went north. The balance of the Sahara depended on it. Travelers wrote of a king so rich that his dogs wore collars of gold and their leashes were spun from silver. It may sound like myth, but the truth was close enough. For centuries, Ghana stood as the gatekeeper between Africa's forests and its sands. It was not a land of isolation, but of connection. Arabic scripts, new faiths, and technologies flowed into its markets. African gold flowed out. But empires rise and empires fall. By the 11th century, drought, war, and shifting trade routes began to weaken Ghana's hold. The desert was patient, and it always takes back what men build upon its edge. Yet from the south came a new power, one that would take the trade, the wealth, and the story even further. Its name was Mali. In the early 13th century, a man named Sundiata Keita united the clans of the savannah under one banner. He founded a new empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the heart of the Sahara. Under his rule, Mali became the beating heart of the gold trade. The city of Timbuktu grew from a small encampment into a center of learning and faith, its libraries filled with books copied by hand, its scholars debating under the shade of mud brick mosques. And then came Mansa Musa, the richest man in human history. In 1324, he made his pilgrimage to Mecca, crossing the desert with tens of thousands of followers and so much gold that the price of it collapsed across Egypt for years. To the world beyond Africa, his journey revealed something astonishing, that deep within the continent lay cities, kingdoms, and cultures of unimaginable sophistication. The trade routes that once belonged to nameless Garamantes now carried the wealth of empires, and the Sahara, far from being empty, was the living artery of an African golden age. At night, the caravans still moved. By day, the kings of Mali sat upon thrones of gold and ivory, and in between them, the desert watched, silent as ever, its dunes glittering like the treasure that flowed across them. Every empire believes its light will last forever, but the desert teaches otherwise. By the late 14th century, the golden cities of West Africa began to fade. The great kings of Mali grew weaker. The mines that had once glittered with gold dust began to run dry, or slipped from royal hands into those of local chiefs. And the caravans that had once moved like rivers of wealth began to thin. The desert was changing. The rains that fed the grasslands grew less certain, and the Sahara crept forward, mile by mile, swallowing fields, wells, and villages. Trade routes shifted with the dunes. Old wells dried up. New paths were found, but not by those who once ruled them. Meanwhile, new powers were rising. The Songhai Empire, once a vassal of Mali, seized the trade routes and cities that had made Mali rich. From the city of Gao, their rulers built a new realm that stretched even farther than Mali's had. For a time, it seemed the age of gold had returned, but something had changed far beyond the horizon. To the north, across the sea, new sails appeared, ships of the Portuguese. They no longer needed to cross the Sahara for Africa's gold. They could reach its coasts directly. In a single generation, the trans-Saharan routes, once the veins of a continent, began to dry up. Salt and gold gave way to new trades, darker ones. The centers of wealth shifted from desert oases to coastal ports. Timbuktu's libraries grew dusty, its scholars' voices quieted. The world moved on. Even so, in the silence of the Sahara, echoes remain. Stone ruins buried by sand, petroglyphs that once marked wells, and stories. Stories of kingdoms that turned sand into gold, of roads that carried ideas across the heart of a continent. The desert remembers everything, even when the world forgets. And as the winds shift and the dunes move, sometimes the past resurfaces. A fragment of pottery, a wall of stone, a forgotten name. Reminders that the Sahara was never empty. It was alive. The Niger River carved its way across the heart of Mali, carrying life in its slow, winding currents. For centuries, it was more than water. It was a highway, a thread connecting towns, markets, and kingdoms. Merchants loaded their canoes with gold dust, ivory, cola nuts, and textiles, drifting downriver to the Atlantic coast, where new eyes and new ships awaited. The roads of Mali stretched even farther than the river. They followed desert edges, linked oasis towns, and guided caravans across plains where heat shimmered like a mirage. Salt from the northern mines moved south. Gold from the forests moved north. Every step, every turn of a camel's foot carried the pulse of an empire, invisible yet unbroken across hundreds of miles. Timbuktu thrived at the crossroads of river and road. Its mud brick streets held markets overflowing with exotic goods, scholars copying texts beneath palm shade, and libraries whose shelves weighed heavy with knowledge. Here, the African interior met the Mediterranean world, and the desert highways made it possible. Yet, even as Mali reached its peak, cracks began to form. The rivers shifted, droughts whispered across the savannah. Some roads became impassable, and towns that had thrived on steady trade began to falter. The empire's wealth, once so concentrated in kings and merchants, became a burden, difficult to defend, easy to attack. Caravans carried on, but their travelers noticed the subtle changes. Fewer oxen along the banks, more abandoned wells, and villages quieter than memory recalled. And yet, the Niger still flowed, stubborn and eternal, a reminder that the land had its own rhythms, indifferent to human ambition. Trade endured, and Mali's roads remained arteries of connection. Even after the empire's power waned, caravans crossed the desert and rivers alike, linking cultures and markets, passing down traditions, languages, and stories. The empire faded, but its paths remained, proof that rivers and roads could sustain civilization even in the harshest landscapes. In Mali, as elsewhere, the Sahara and the Niger together had shaped not just empires, but human imagination. The river and the road carried more than goods. They carried history, memory, and the promise that even when empires fall, the network of life persists. For centuries, the caravans moved like slow rivers across the dunes, a lifeline of salt, gold, and culture. Hundreds of camels stretched along the desert paths, their bells ringing softly under starlit skies, their riders knowing every wadi, every oasis, every hidden well. But the world beyond the Sahara was changing. In the 15th century, European ships rounded the coast of West Africa, seeking gold and trade in ways the desert had never seen. No longer did merchants need to cross hundreds of miles of sand to reach the Mediterranean. They could sail directly to the coast, trading for gold, ivory, and slaves in ports teeming with goods from across the globe. The impact on the desert kingdoms was profound. Caravans became smaller, routes less traveled, and once thriving oasis cities began to quiet. Timbuktu's markets, though still alive with learning and scholarship, saw fewer traders arrive by camel. The roads that had carried Mali, Gao, Tekrur, and countless smaller kingdoms across centuries of trade now lay under the quiet shadow of decline. Yet the desert was patient. For generations, the caravans persisted, carrying what remained of tradition and commerce. Salt still moved south, gold still moved north, stories still crossed dunes as they always had. But the great rhythm that had pulsed through the Sahara for centuries was slowing. By the 18th century, the age of the camel and caravan was fading. Oasis kingdoms fell into silence, their walls crumbling under the relentless wind. Rivers shifted, wells dried, and sand claimed paths once polished by the steps of countless travelers. Even in decline, the legacy endured. The roads carved into the desert became the skeleton of a continent's memory, guiding future explorers, historians, and dreamers. Though the caravans have stopped, their echo remains, in the dunes, in the ruined cities, in the stories passed from one generation to the next. The Sahara, timeless, unforgiving, yet ever watchful, keeps its secrets close. And though the caravans no longer march across its vast expanse, the history they carried lives on, a bridge between the forgotten kingdoms of yesterday and the world we seek to understand today. Long before satellites or aerial surveys, the Sahara was read not with instruments, but with eyes, intuition, and memory. Desert mystics, men and women who knew the language of sand and stars, wandered its endless expanse. They could find water where none appeared, read the direction of shifting dunes, and navigate the invisible arteries of trade that crisscrossed the desert. These guides were more than travelers. They were storytellers, scholars, and keepers of secret knowledge passed down through generations. In whispered tones around campfires, they recounted the movements of caravans, the locations of hidden wells, and the histories of kingdoms long swallowed by sand. A single mistake could mean death for a caravan. A single insight could make a journey possible where others would fail. At the same time, map makers in far-off lands began to sketch the Sahara, piecing together information from merchants, travelers, and the mystics themselves. Early Arabic and Berber charts marked rivers that no longer flowed, cities that were already ruins, and trade routes that shifted with the seasons. Maps became more than tools. They were bridges between worlds, recording not only geography, but the human stories embedded in the desert. Some mystics were also scholars of the stars. By tracking constellations and the changing positions of the sun, they guided caravans across hundreds of miles of sand, ensuring that traders reached Timbuktu, Gao, and the hidden oases that dotted the routes. Their knowledge blurred the line between science and legend. Some stories speak of men who could sense storms before they arrived, of women who found water with nothing but a chant and a careful reading of the earth. Together, the mystics and mapmakers shaped the Sahara as much as the river and the camel ever had. Without their wisdom, the kingdoms of gold might never have thrived. Without their charts, the routes that connected empires might have been lost entirely to the dunes. Even today, when satellite images reveal the faint shadows of ancient settlements, when archaeologists uncover ruins beneath shifting sands, the legacy of those early guides endures. They were the silent authors of the desert, inscribing knowledge across dunes, riverbeds, and starlit skies. A map of memory in a world that might have otherwise been forgotten. Oases were more than stops for water and rest. They were the beating hearts of knowledge in the Sahara. Here, desert mystics gathered with scholars, merchants, and travelers, exchanging wisdom carried across dunes and rivers alike. These were places where the desert's silence met human curiosity, and where knowledge was as precious as gold dust. At towns like Kadames, Tadmakat, and Walata, mystics became guides not only for caravans but for culture itself. They taught merchants to read the stars, measure the shadows, and navigate by wind and sun. They preserved oral histories of kingdoms, genealogies of rulers, and stories of battles long forgotten. Their lessons were subtle, hidden in poetry, songs, and rituals. Yet they ensured that memory survived the desert's erasing hand. Some mystics were also healers, using local herbs and desert remedies to tend both travelers and townsfolk. Their knowledge of the land, which plants could sustain a life, which waters were safe to drink, kept entire caravans alive, and they often acted as diplomats, mediating disputes between traders, rulers, and clans. In a world where a single mistake could mean death, their wisdom was invaluable. Trade routes became classrooms. Every caravan passing through an oasis was an opportunity to exchange more than goods. Languages, philosophies, and stories flowed along with gold and salt. Mystics taught merchants about neighboring cultures, the customs of distant lands, and the principles of fair trade. In doing so, they shaped not only commerce, but the very networks of civilization that spanned the Sahara. By preserving knowledge, guiding travelers, and linking isolated communities, these mystics ensured that the desert was never truly silent. Even after empires declined and caravans slowed, the wisdom of the oasis persisted, recorded in manuscripts, carved into stone, and remembered in the songs of those who still walked the desert paths. The desert itself seemed to recognize them. It did not erase their memory, nor scatter their teachings. Instead, it carried them forward, hidden in wind-sculpted dunes, waiting for travelers who could read both sand and star. The Sahara was a vast living puzzle, its dunes shifting and rivers hiding beneath sand. To outsiders, it seemed unknowable, a desert without shape or pattern. But for centuries, a different kind of map was being drawn, not with ink alone, but with observation, memory, and intuition. Caravan leaders and desert mystics were the first cartographers. Their maps were mental, etched into minds and passed along orally, a combination of landmarks, stars, and the rhythm of the wind. They knew the distance between wells, the location of hidden oases, and the timing of seasonal storms. This knowledge allowed traders to cross hundreds of miles without a single written chart. By the 12th century, scholars began to formalize these routes. Manuscripts recorded rivers, trade centers, and desert hazards. Maps in Arabic script appeared in Timbuktu and Gao, showing more than geography. They marked the pulse of commerce, the paths of kingdoms, and the invisible veins that connected empires. European explorers and traders, arriving later, relied on these accounts. Legends and measurements from mystics and merchants were translated into maps that guided ships and caravans alike. In some cases, the desert itself became part of the map. Sand patterns, fossil riverbeds, and the outlines of dunes informing the placement of cities and roads. Even today, when satellites reveal ancient trade networks, we see the echoes of those early maps. Paths that no longer carry gold or salt still exist in the desert's memory, etched by the footsteps of countless travelers. Invisible lines became roads, and roads became empires. Cartography was never just about land. It was about survival, connection, and storytelling. It was how humans turned the Sahara from a void into a living, navigable world. And in those maps, whether carved in manuscript or traced in sand, lies the secret of a desert that is vast, deadly, and endlessly generous to those who understand its language. The desert mystics were more than guides. They were the guardians of memory. Their wisdom did not end with the last caravan or the final merchant caravan crossing the dunes. Instead, it traveled forward, shaping the journeys of explorers, scholars, and mapmakers for centuries to come. European travelers who ventured into the Sahara relied heavily on the tales passed down by mystics. They described wells hidden behind shifting dunes, trading oases, and routes known only to those who had walked the desert for decades. Without their knowledge, countless expeditions would have failed, swallowed by the heat, the wind, and the unyielding sands. But the mystics left more than practical knowledge. They preserved the stories of vanished kingdoms, the empires of Mali, Gao, and Tekrur, in song, poetry, and oral histories. They taught travelers about the ethics of trade, the honor of hospitality, and the delicate balance between humans and the harsh desert environment. Through them, the Sahara became more than a desert. It became a teacher. Manuscripts in Timbuktu, libraries in Gao, and the hidden notes of wandering scholars bear witness to their legacy. The paths they guided caravans along were later recorded on maps. Their stories shaped the understanding of the Sahara long before modern archaeology or satellite imagery. Even today, the desert carries their voice. Archaeologists and explorers find ruins, wells, and forgotten settlements, often guided by the faint trails and oral knowledge that survive generations. The mystics' influence endures not just in physical landmarks, but in the way the Sahara is read, understood, and respected. In essence, the desert remembers them. Every trade route traced, every oasis discovered, every star used for guidance, all are echoes of the mystics' insight. Their legacy is the living map of the Sahara, a network of human ingenuity and survival that continues to inspire those who seek to understand the desert's vast, hidden history. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Sahara was no longer entirely invisible to the outside world. European cartographers, explorers, and scholars began to chart its expanse with unprecedented detail, guided in part by the wisdom of the desert mystics. Their maps were a blend of art, science, and imagination. Coastlines were drawn with accuracy, oasis towns marked with careful notation, and the courses of ancient caravan roads traced through the dunes. Some maps included the faint ghostlings of rivers that had long since vanished, and the shadowy remnants of cities swallowed by sand. They captured not just geography, but history itself. Explorers ventured deeper than ever before, following the trails preserved in oral histories. Instruments measured latitudes, travelers recorded cultural practices, and sketches depicted architectural marvels hidden in the desert. They documented the intricate systems of wells, fogaras, and fortified settlements, the silent infrastructure that had supported empires for centuries. Yet even the most precise map could not capture the Sahara's living nature. Dunes shifted, rivers changed course, and storms erased the markers of human presence overnight. Cartographers quickly realized that to understand the desert, one needed both observation and memory, instrument and intuition. Through their efforts, the Sahara became legible to the wider world. Trade routes, kingdoms, and oasis cities were no longer mysteries, but recorded histories awaiting further discovery. Maps allowed scholars to trace the rise and fall of empires, to understand the flow of goods and culture, and to see the desert as a network rather than an empty void. Even today, these maps guide archaeologists, historians, and explorers. Satellite imagery now supplements the work of early cartographers, but the foundations remain: the mystics' knowledge, the caravans' paths, and the careful drawings of men and women who refused to let the desert remain unknown. The Sahara had been mapped, but never conquered. Its final frontiers were charted, yet its secrets endure, waiting for those patient enough to read the dunes, follow the stars, and listen to the echoes of the desert's eternal memory. The Sahara was never static. Even as trade routes persisted and caravans moved like lifeblood across the dunes, the empires themselves were in constant flux. Kingdoms that had once dominated gold and salt now faced new rivals, new threats, and changing environments. Songhai rose where Mali had once reigned. Its rulers expanded territories along the Niger, controlling trade with a combination of military might and clever diplomacy. Timbuktu and Gao flourished, their markets alive with merchants from distant lands, their mosques echoing with scholars who preserved centuries of knowledge. But power was never permanent. Internal conflicts, succession crises, and shifting alliances tested every ruler. The desert was patient but unforgiving. Drought could decimate crops, caravans could be attacked, and once mighty cities could fall silent overnight. Meanwhile, the world beyond Africa was changing. European traders pressed along the coasts, maritime empires grew, and the flow of goods began to bypass the desert altogether. Empires that once depended on long-distance caravans now had to adapt or decline. Some survived by strengthening local trade. Others faded into obscurity, leaving only ruins to mark their existence. Even smaller kingdoms played their part. Oasis cities and desert fortresses became centers of learning and commerce, quietly linking the great empires and preserving culture in the shadows of history. Merchants, mystics, and local rulers adapted, their knowledge and strategies keeping civilization alive in a land that could so easily forget them. The Sahara was a mirror, reflecting both ambition and fragility. Empires rose with the tides of trade and fell with the winds of change. And yet, through it all, the desert endured. Its dunes shifting, but its memory persistent, holding the stories of rulers, traders, and the networks that tied them together across the vast, unforgiving land. The Sahara is a land of extremes, and its people have always lived at the mercy of the elements. By the 15th and 16th centuries, subtle shifts in climate began to ripple across the desert and the Sahel. Rainfall became less predictable. Rivers swelled in some years, vanished in others. Fields that once fed caravans and towns struggled to produce enough grain, and wells that had lasted generations slowly dried. Trade, once the lifeblood of empires, began to shift. Coastal European ports offered new routes, bypassing the long, arduous caravan roads. Merchants could now reach distant markets without crossing hundreds of miles of sand. The wealth that had flowed steadily across the Sahara began to dwindle, altering the balance of power between kingdoms. These changes forced adaptation. Oasis cities became more self-reliant, focusing on local trade and agriculture. Smaller kingdoms formed alliances, negotiated new agreements, and sometimes turned to raiding to survive. Social structures shifted. Families and clans moved. Populations migrated toward more reliable water sources, and old patterns of authority were challenged. Even culture evolved in response to these pressures. Oral traditions preserved histories of lost rivers and vanished towns, teaching younger generations the lessons of survival. Mystics and scholars guided communities through uncertain times, using stars, winds, and memory to navigate both desert and life. Yet for all these transformations, the Sahara remained both constant and inscrutable. The dunes shifted, hiding old roads while revealing new ones. The wind erased traces of failure and preserved traces of endurance. Through scarcity, disruption, and change, the desert shaped its people, forcing ingenuity, resilience, and connection across great distances. By the end of this era, the Sahara had become a land of stories as much as sand. Every dried riverbed, every abandoned caravan route, every quiet oasis carried evidence of adaptation. And while empires rose and fell, and trade shifted to distant seas, the lessons of survival, navigation, and cultural persistence endured, encoded in the very fabric of the desert itself. The desert had long controlled the flow of wealth and knowledge, but the world beyond Africa's coasts was awakening. By the 15th century, European sailors rounded the Cape Verde Islands, then the West African coast, seeking gold, ivory, and human cargo. Ships brought goods that bypassed the ancient caravan networks entirely. For centuries, camel and river had dictated trade. Now, wind and sail began to redraw the map. Coastal ports became the new hubs of commerce, linking Europe, Africa, and eventually the Americas. Oasis cities and inland empires, once masters of gold and salt, watched as caravans grew thinner and markets quieter. Some kingdoms adapted, sending emissaries to the coasts, negotiating new routes and partnerships. Others resisted, clinging to old roads that now seemed increasingly perilous. The desert itself, ever patient, seemed indifferent to these human struggles. Dunes shifted, rivers silted, and ancient paths slowly vanished beneath the sand. Cultural life, too, shifted with these currents. Learning centers that had thrived along caravan routes, Timbuktu, Gao, and Walata, saw fewer travelers arrive, yet their scholars persisted, preserving manuscripts, maps, and histories. Trade had moved outward, but knowledge remained rooted in the desert, a testament to centuries of resilience. By the 17th century, the balance of power had tilted irrevocably. The empires that had dominated trans-Saharan trade could no longer command wealth as they once had. Yet their legacy endured in architecture, written records, and the oral histories passed through generations. The desert had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, and even as trade shifted to the coast, it kept the memory of those empires alive. In the end, the Sahara was both witness and participant. It had shaped civilizations, preserved knowledge, and even in decline, continued to influence the course of history. The coastal currents had changed the game, but the desert's story remained, silent, enduring, and endlessly instructive for those who took the time to listen. Even as trade shifted to the coasts and empires faltered, the Sahara refused to be erased. Its people adapted, finding ways to survive and thrive in a world of changing power. Oasis towns remained hubs of commerce, culture, and learning, even as caravans became fewer and farther between. Nomadic tribes, long accustomed to hardship, played an increasingly central role. They guided travelers through shifting dunes, safeguarded hidden wells, and maintained networks of information that could span hundreds of miles. Their knowledge, honed over generations, ensured that commerce, culture, and survival continued despite the absence of great empires. Local rulers also adapted. Some shifted focus from long-distance trade to regional markets, building alliances with coastal powers while preserving autonomy in their desert domains. Others strengthened religious and cultural institutions, ensuring that scholarship, oral history, and traditional knowledge endured even as political power waned. Art, music, and storytelling thrived in this environment of resilience. Poets sang of vanished cities, heroic merchants, and the enduring beauty of the desert. Oral historians recounted the paths of caravans and the rise and fall of kings, passing lessons to each new generation. Even when sand buried the walls of once great cities, the memory of those places lived on in words and song. The Sahara had always been a teacher, demanding ingenuity, patience, and courage. Even in decline, it shaped the lives of those who remained, offering lessons about survival, adaptation, and the impermanence of human ambition. And though inland empires faded, their influence persisted in the networks, knowledge, and culture that continue to define desert life. In every dune, every oasis, every quiet riverbed, the desert told the story of resilience, a story that would carry forward into the modern era, reminding the world that even when civilizations fall, the spirit of a place and its people endures. By the 18th century, the Sahara's great caravans were shadows of their former glory. Trade had shifted to the coasts, empires had fractured, and once bustling routes now carried only small local convoys. Yet, the desert endured, silent and watchful, preserving its secrets and memories in dunes, ruins, and wells. Oasis cities still thrived in pockets, centers of learning, culture, and refuge for travelers. Merchants continued to exchange salt, gold, and ivory, though the scale was diminished. Nomadic guides and local rulers became the keepers of knowledge, ensuring that desert survival and navigation persisted across generations. The old kingdoms, Gao, Tekrur, and countless smaller realms, were no longer powers of wealth and influence. Their walls crumbled, their markets slowed, and their names faded from the maps drawn by distant explorers. Yet they left a legacy that the desert itself would guard, the memory of trade, culture, and human ingenuity thriving in a harsh, unforgiving land. Even as colonial ambitions began to reach the edges of the Sahara, the desert remained untamed. Its vastness challenged explorers, its climate tested armies, and its history resisted simplification. The caravan routes may have dwindled, but their imprint endured in the cultural, economic, and geographic knowledge that had been painstakingly accumulated over centuries. The twilight of the caravans was not an end, but a transformation. The Sahara's stories, once carried by camels and traders, now passed into the hands of scholars, travelers, and eventually historians. Though empires fell and trade shifted, the desert preserved the memory of human endeavor, waiting for future generations to uncover the richness of its past. The Sahara, eternal and patient, had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the triumphs and failures of kings, and the enduring spirit of those who dared to traverse it. Its twilight was not silence, but a promise that even in decline, history could be preserved, remembered, and learned from. The Sahara had long been a land of its own rules, where empires rose and fell according to the rhythms of sand, river, and caravan. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, new forces appeared on its borders. European powers, driven by trade, exploration, and conquest, began to push inland from the coasts, seeking control over resources, ports, and trade networks. For centuries, the desert had dictated its own pace. Oasis towns, nomadic tribes, and inland kingdoms balanced power, trade, and survival with remarkable skill. Now, foreign ships, firearms, and mercenary armies threatened to disrupt that balance. Local rulers responded with a mixture of diplomacy, resistance, and adaptation. Some welcomed alliances with Europeans to strengthen their own position. Others resisted fiercely, knowing that surrender meant losing control over centuries of accumulated wealth and culture. The desert itself became a stage for these shifting dynamics, its vastness both a shield and a challenge to invaders unfamiliar with its hidden dangers. Trade patterns continued to evolve. Routes that had once connected kingdoms for centuries now intersected with European influence, altering the flow of goods, wealth, and culture. Salt, gold, and ivory were still carried by camel caravans, but now alongside new goods, taxes, and foreign emissaries. Even in the face of conquest, the Sahara preserved its secrets. Nomads guided travelers, scholars recorded events, and the desert's memory held fast to the histories of the past. Every dune, every oasis, every abandoned city whispered of empires that had risen and fallen, and of the enduring adaptability of those who lived by the rhythm of the sand. The edge of conquest was a reminder that the Sahara was never truly empty. It was a crossroads of ambition, trade, and survival, where the old world met the new, and where the desert continued to shape human history in ways both subtle and profound. As European forces pushed inland, the Sahara was far from passive. Its people, nomadic tribes, oasis dwellers, and local rulers, became both guides and guardians of the desert. They knew the land intimately, understanding the hidden wells, shifting dunes, and secret paths that armies unfamiliar with the desert could never navigate. Resistance took many forms. Some tribes launched raids on foreign convoys, using mobility and knowledge of the terrain to strike swiftly and vanish into the sands. Other rulers negotiated, forming strategic alliances that preserved autonomy while navigating the new political landscape. Every decision balanced survival, commerce, and cultural preservation. Oasis towns remained critical. They were hubs of intelligence, commerce, and culture, where word of approaching armies could be passed discreetly, where caravans could be rerouted, and where local knowledge guided decisions about trade and defense. Scholars, mystics, and elders played key roles, advising leaders on navigation, diplomacy, and strategy. The desert itself became a silent ally. Sandstorms, sudden droughts, and shifting dunes created natural barriers that slowed even the most determined intruders. The Sahara demanded respect, and those who ignored its power often paid the ultimate price. Yet adaptation was equally important. Trade persisted, sometimes covertly, sometimes in cooperation with newcomers. Local economies adjusted, learning to accommodate new goods, currencies, and technologies while maintaining centuries-old networks of exchange. Through all of this, the Sahara's people demonstrated a resilience that outlasted empires and invasions alike. The guardians of the sand ensured that the Sahara remained a place of continuity amid change. Even as new powers arrived, the knowledge, culture, and survival strategies of its people endured, a testament to centuries of adaptation in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. European powers controlled the coasts, introducing new goods, currencies, and methods of transport that began to alter the rhythm of desert commerce. Camel caravans still moved, but alongside them came firearms, textiles, and metal tools imported from distant lands. Merchants adapted, learning to integrate these new commodities into centuries-old trading networks. Markets shifted subtly, blending traditional goods with foreign wares, creating a hybrid economy that reflected both continuity and change. Communication and navigation also transformed. Maps drawn by European explorers were more precise, and written records replaced some oral traditions. Telegraph lines, and later, railways began to touch the edges of the desert, shrinking distances that had once required weeks or months of travel. Yet even as technology arrived, the desert resisted full control. Sandstorms could still bury roads, heat could cripple machinery, and isolated oases remained challenging to access. Cultural life mirrored these shifts. Scholars continued to preserve manuscripts, oral traditions thrived in caravans, and mystics guided travelers through both old and new realities. The desert remained a classroom, teaching adaptation, resilience, and the delicate balance between human ambition and environmental reality. By the end of the century, the Sahara had become a hybrid world. It was a place where centuries-old knowledge met European technology, where trade routes adapted rather than vanished, and where cultures negotiated survival amidst growing external influence. In this transformation, the Sahara remained a force to be reckoned with, a living, shifting landscape that shaped all who entered it, reminding the world that even as trade and empires changed, the desert's rhythm endured. The Sahara has always demanded ingenuity, and the arrival of colonial powers tested that skill in new ways. Empires that had once ruled trade routes now faced foreign armies, administrators, and new laws. Yet the desert's people refused to surrender its secrets easily. Resistance took many forms. Nomadic tribes used mobility and knowledge of the land to evade and confront intruders. Oasis towns fortified themselves, preserving culture, trade, and learning, even as external forces encroached. Scholars, mystics, and elders guided communities, balancing diplomacy with defense, survival with principle. Adaptation was equally important. Merchants learned to work within new systems, integrating foreign goods while maintaining old networks. Local rulers negotiated treaties that preserved autonomy where possible, blending traditional governance with imposed structures. The desert became a classroom in strategy, teaching those who listened how to survive politically, economically, and socially. Even under pressure, cultural life endured. Oral histories, poetry, and storytelling thrived, preserving the memory of empires, caravans, and trade routes. Religious, scientific, and navigational knowledge continued to be shared, passing through generations as both guidance and resistance. The Sahara's resilience was a quiet force. It shaped how people responded to the changing world, ensuring that knowledge, culture, and survival strategies persisted, even as empires fell and colonial influence grew. The desert taught that survival was not simply enduring, it was adapting, preserving, and thriving under pressure. By the end of this era, the Sahara had weathered yet another transformation. The empires may have changed, the caravans may have thinned, and foreign powers may have arrived, but the desert's memory, its lessons, and its culture remained unbroken, a testament to the enduring spirit of its people and the land itself. By the early 20th century, the Sahara had entered a new age. European colonial powers now controlled much of the desert's edges, establishing forts, railways, and administrative outposts. The great caravan routes, once the lifeblood of empires, had diminished in size and importance. Yet the desert spirit endured, quietly guiding those who still traversed its vastness. Oasis towns adapted, becoming centers of trade, knowledge, and cultural preservation. Nomadic tribes continued their seasonal migrations, carrying stories, traditions, and practical knowledge across hundreds of miles. Merchants moved with caution, blending old routes with new colonial infrastructure, ensuring that commerce persisted even in reduced form. Colonial maps, railways, and telegraphs transformed the Sahara's landscape, but they could not erase centuries of human ingenuity. Ancient paths, hidden wells, and cultural knowledge persisted, passed down through generations. The desert became a layered world, where modernity and tradition coexisted, each shaping the other. Even as empires fell and new authorities arrived, the Sahara remained a teacher. Its lessons in navigation, adaptation, and resilience continued to influence travelers, historians, and local communities. Manuscripts from Timbuktu and Gao, oral histories from nomads, and the ruins of oasis cities preserve the memory of centuries of trade, learning, and human endeavor. The last caravans were not an end, but a bridge. They connected past and present, tradition and modernity, memory and survival. The Sahara, ever patient, had witnessed empires rise and fall, trade flourish and fade. Yet through it all, it preserved the story of its people and their enduring spirit. In the quiet of the dunes, the desert whispered its final lesson of this era. Even as the world changes, wisdom, culture, and resilience endure. The Sahara's past is never truly buried. Beneath shifting dunes lie the remnants of empires, caravan roads, and forgotten cities. Archaeologists, historians, and adventurers have slowly uncovered traces of the kingdoms that once thrived here: Mali, Songhai, Tekrur, their wealth and influence etched in stone, clay, and manuscript. Yet the desert itself is the most enduring record. Its winds preserve and erase in equal measure, leaving only fragments for those patient enough to interpret them. Nomadic knowledge, passed orally for generations, guides explorers to hidden wells, ancient trade routes, and ruins long lost to maps. In every grain of sand, the Sahara holds a story of survival, ingenuity, and human endeavor. Modern technology allows new perspectives. Satellite imagery reveals the faint outlines of roads that once carried camels laden with gold, salt, and ivory. Drones capture aerial views of ruins invisible from the ground, and digital archives preserve manuscripts that recount the lives of kings, merchants, and mystics. Even as the world advances, the desert's ancient lessons remain vital on adaptation, endurance, and the delicate balance between humans and nature. The Sahara's memory endures not only in the past, but in the lives of those who still call it home. Nomads maintain traditions, oasis towns continue to thrive, and cultural knowledge is passed down with the same reverence as centuries ago. The echoes of caravans, mystics, and kings resonate across the sands, reminding the modern world that history is alive, if one knows how to listen. Today, the Sahara is both a challenge and a classroom. Modern cities dot its edges, mining operations extract resources once traded by camel, and tourism brings thousands to experience its vast landscapes. Yet, despite roads, satellites, and air travel, the desert's true nature remains unchanged, vast, harsh, and capable of teaching patience and resilience. Environmental challenges remind us of the desert's power. Droughts, desertification, and climate change echo the historical hardships faced by traders and nomads alike. Communities that have survived centuries of extremes continue to adapt, blending traditional knowledge with modern techniques to farm, trade, and live sustainably. Cultural preservation is equally vital. Oasis towns like Timbuktu continue to safeguard manuscripts, mosques, and libraries, while oral traditions, music, and storytelling keep history alive. Modern Saharan artists, writers, and scholars draw on the rich legacy of trade, mysticism, and empire to inform contemporary life. The desert also inspires beyond its borders. Researchers study ancient trade networks to understand globalization, climate patterns to prepare for environmental change, and historical maps to trace human ingenuity. In this way, the Sahara bridges the past and present, offering lessons that remain relevant in the modern era. Even as the modern world encroaches, the Sahara continues to demand respect. Its vastness, history, and enduring spirit remind us that landscapes are not passive. They shape human civilization as much as people shape them. The echoes of the desert, from the first caravan to the satellites of today, tell a story of continuity, adaptation, and the remarkable resilience of both land and people.